You've probably heard the Sherman tank called a death trap, a Tommy cooker that lit up every time it was hit. But what you haven't heard is the actual reason why 70% of early Sherman crews who were hit watched their tanks erupt in flames within seconds. And I promise you, it's far more disturbing than the myths you've been told. Now, before we get to what really happened inside those burning metal boxes, we need to clear up the biggest lie ever told about the Sherman. For decades, people have blamed the gasoline engine. They say diesel fuel does not burn like gasoline, that the Germans and Soviets were smart to use diesel while the Americans stupidly chose gasoline and got their crews killed. But here is the thing, the engine had almost nothing to do with it. The engine compartment was separated from the crew by a firewall, and it had automatic fire suppression systems. When a Sherman's engine caught fire, the crew usually had time to bail out. The problem was never in the back of the tank. The problem was sitting right next to the crew the entire time. But before we get into what really killed these crews, if you are interested in the forgotten stories of World War II that most documentaries will not tell you, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We are bringing you the brutal truths about the most dangerous jobs in military history. In 1942, when the first Shermans rolled into combat in North Africa, they carried 97 rounds of 75mm ammunition. That is 97 high-explosive shells stored in racks throughout the crew compartment. Those shells were unprotected, sitting in open sponson racks on both sides of the tank, exactly where a German anti-tank round would enter. The racks were positioned exactly where most hits occurred, in the midsection of the tank, at the widest and most exposed part of the hull. Think about that for a second. The ammunition, the most explosive thing in the entire tank besides the fuel, was stored in the most likely place to be hit with no protection whatsoever. And when a German 75mm or 88mm round punched through the Sherman's armor, it did not just pass through cleanly. These rounds had delayed fuses with explosive fillers. They penetrated the armor, then detonated inside the tank like a hand grenade going off in a closet. Now imagine what happens when that explosion hits 97 unprotected artillery shells. The Sherman would erupt, not catch fire, not slowly burn. It would explode into flames so fast that crews called it brewing up. The British had a different name for it. They called it the Tommy cooker because it cooked British soldiers alive. And though historians debate whether American crews actually used nicknames like this during the war, the reality of what happened inside these tanks made any nickname seem appropriate. But here is something that will make you sick. Crews knew about the ammunition problem. They were terrified. So what did they do? They brought extra ammunition. I know that sounds insane, but put yourself in their position. You are going into combat against German tanks and anti-tank guns that outrange you and can kill you from distances where you cannot even shoot back. The last thing you want is to run out of ammo in the middle of a battle. So crews would cram in 120, 130, sometimes 140 rounds of ammunition, packing shells anywhere they could find space. They turned their tank into a bomb on purpose, because running out of ammunition in combat seemed worse than the risk of fire. And that decision killed thousands of them. The statistics from 1942 and 1943 are absolutely brutal. When a Sherman was hit by enemy fire, 60 to 80% of the time it would catch fire within seconds, not minutes. One British study found that when ammunition ignited, the fire spread through the entire ammunition load in under 3 seconds. The air itself became so hot it seared your lungs if you tried to breathe. Remember, 5 men are trapped inside when this happens. Now let's talk about those 5 men and why escape was nearly impossible, even if you survived the initial hit. The Sherman had a crew of 5. The driver and assistant driver sat in the front hull. The gunner, loader, and commander sat in the turret. Each position had its own nightmare when the tank was hit. Start with the driver and assistant driver. They sat low in the hull,
with narrow, rectangular hatches above their heads. These hatches were barely 18 inches wide. You are the driver. An 88mm round just punched through your tank and hit the ammunition. The crew compartment instantly fills with flames and black smoke, so thick you cannot see your own hands. The temperature spikes in seconds. You have maybe 5 seconds before you die. But first, you have to do several things. Release your seat restraints. Find the hatch lever in complete darkness through the smoke. Push the heavy, spring-loaded hatch open while flames are cooking the skin off your face and hands. Pull yourself up and out through an 18-inch opening while wearing bulky clothing and gear. And you have to do all of this while your lungs are being seared by superheated air, and you literally cannot see anything. Most drivers never made it out. The assistant driver had it even worse in some ways. His position was more cramped, and he sat next to a fixed machine gun mount that could block his movement. But at least the drivers had their own hatches. Now let's talk about the 3 men in the turret, because their situation was absolutely horrific. Early Shermans had a single 2-piece hatch for all 3 turret crew members, 1 hatch for 3 grown men. Let that sink in for a moment. The commander sat at the back of the turret. The gunner sat in front of him. The loader sat to the left, behind and around the main gun breech. When the tank was buttoned up for combat, they were pressed together in a space about as big as a phone booth. Now imagine the tank gets hit. Ammunition ignites. The turret fills with flames and smoke. 3 men, who might not be dead yet, have about 3 to 5 seconds to get through one hatch that is less than 2 feet across. And here is the problem. They cannot all go at once. The commander has to go first because he is sitting right under the hatch. But what if the commander is dead or wounded? What if the shell that hit the tank came through the turret and killed him instantly? He is now slumped over in front of the only exit while the loader and gunner are dying in the flames behind him. One Sherman loader who survived told his story years later. His tank was hit by a German anti-tank gun in France in 1944. The round went through the turret and killed both the commander and gunner instantly. They slumped forward onto each other, blocking the hatch. He tried to push their bodies out of the way, but they were deadweight and tangled together. The smoke was so thick he could not see them. He could not breathe. His hands were burning from touching the hot metal as he tried to climb over the bodies. After what he said felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, he gave up trying to escape through the turret hatch. By pure luck, the turret happened to be rotated so he could climb down into the driver's compartment. The driver had already bailed out and left his hatch open. The loader crawled over the dead assistant driver, pulled himself through the driver's hatch, and got out just before the tank exploded. He said he could smell his own hair burning as he ran away from the Sherman. When he looked back, the entire tank was a fireball. He was one of the lucky ones. Now you might be thinking, surely after they saw this happening, they fixed it, right? They did, but it did not happen until late 1943. That was over a year of crews dying in burning Shermans before the Army added a second hatch for the loader. Hundreds of men burned alive because it took that long to add another hatch to the turret. Even with 2 hatches, escape was still nearly impossible once the ammunition ignited, because the fire was simply too fast. The Army knew about this problem early. They conducted tests and studies. They found that wet stowage, a system where ammunition was stored in racks surrounded by water glycol fluid, could dramatically reduce fire risk. The fluid was supposed to spill out when the rack was penetrated and extinguish or delay the fire long enough for the crew to escape. Combined with moving all the ammunition down to the floor of the hull, where it was less likely to be hit, wet stowage reduced the chance of fire after a hit from 60 to 80% down to 10 to 15%. But wet stowage did not start reaching tanks in meaningful numbers until 1944. That is 2 years into Sherman combat operations. 2 years of Sherman crews burning alive in tanks while the solution existed but was not implemented. And even when crews did get Sherman tanks with wet stowage, they still died at horrific rates because the wet stowage only worked if it was not overloaded. Remember, crews were still cramming in extra ammunition because they were more afraid of running out of ammo than they were of the fire risk.
Some wet stowage tanks had shells stuffed in every available space, completely defeating the safety system. Here is something else that is disturbing. The Army did a study between 1944 and 1945 and found that one crew member died for each Sherman knocked out. That might not sound too bad until you remember there were 5 men in each tank. So on average, 20% of the crew died when their tank was hit. But that is an average. When a Sherman caught fire, which happened 60 to 80% of the time in early models, the survival rate was much, much worse. The crews who pulled that average up were the ones whose tanks were disabled by track hits, engine damage, or other mechanical failures that did not involve fire. When ammunition ignited, it was rare for more than 1 or 2 crew members to escape, and the ones who did escape were often horribly burned. 3rd degree and 4th degree burns covered 30, 40, or 50% of their bodies. Faces melted, hands fused into claws. Some survived only to spend months or years in burn wards, enduring dozens of surgeries. Many would have preferred to die in the tank. I do not say that to be dramatic. Several survivors said exactly that in interviews after the war. Now let's talk about what happened after a Sherman burned out, because it is important to understand the full scope of this. When a Sherman was hit and brewed up completely, burning for 10, 15, or 20 minutes until all the ammunition and fuel were consumed, the Army would send recovery crews to salvage it. These were recovery teams. Sometimes these were mechanics from maintenance units. Sometimes they were the poor men from Graves Registration whose job was to collect the dead from battlefields. They would have to go inside the burned-out Sherman and remove what was left of the crew. The remains were not recognizable as human. The crew was gone. I have to be careful how I describe this because this is YouTube and I cannot be graphic. At extreme temperatures, organic material does not just burn. It reduces to ash and fragments. What recovery crews found inside was charcoal and residue. They would open the bottom escape hatch and use hoses to flush everything out. Then they would repaint the interior so the next crew would not see the stains or know what happened to the last crew that had manned that tank. Yes, many of those burned out Shermans were repaired, repainted, and put back into service with new crews who had no idea they were climbing into a tank where 5 men had burned alive weeks or months earlier. Those tanks returned to the line. Here is the part that makes this even more tragic. The gasoline engine myth, the thing everyone blames, was never the real problem. Gasoline is more flammable than diesel, and diesel engines are safer. But engine fires were often survivable, and the crew could bail out. The real killer was the ammunition stowage design. That design was a deliberate engineering choice to simplify production and speed up manufacturing. The Army knew the sponson racks were vulnerable. British tank designs from the 1930s had already moved ammunition to the hull floor for this exact reason. The Sherman was designed for mass production, and sponson racks were easier and faster to install than floor storage. Production priorities won out, so in the rush to build tanks quickly, ammunition was placed in the worst possible location, and thousands of American and British tank crews paid the price. Thousands paid the price. The grim nicknames were not soldier humor. They were a bitter acknowledgement that the tank was designed wrong, and the crews knew it. Every time they climbed into a Sherman, they understood that if they were hit, they probably would not get out. They did it anyway because it was their job. Some crews went through 2, 3, or 4 Shermans. They would get hit, bail out if they were lucky, watch their friends burn alive, then climb into another Sherman and go back into combat because someone had to do it. When I think about what those men faced, knowing their tank would probably burn if hit, and knowing they could not escape once it started, and still climbing in day after day, it makes the whole Sherman debate seem trivial. The gasoline versus diesel argument, the armor thickness debates, the gun caliber discussions, none of it matters compared to what it must have felt like to sit in that tank knowing you were surrounded by unprotected ammunition, and that if anything hit it, you had 3 seconds to live. And 70% of the time when they were hit, their tank erupted in flames. If this story hit you as hard as it hit me when I researched it, please subscribe to the channel. We are committed to telling the forgotten stories of the men who fought in history's most dangerous roles. The stories that mainstream documentaries will not touch. Hit that notification bell so you do not miss our next video on the terrifying reality of being a ball turret gunner in a B-17.